Welcome back to the Grimdark Archives. There is a Primarch who held perfection in one hand and damnation in the other, and he couldn't tell the difference, not until it was far, far too late. And here's what makes Fulgrim's story the most disturbing fall in all of Warhammer 40,000. It wasn't ignorance that destroyed him, it wasn't weakness, it was the very thing that made him great. His relentless, burning, obsessive need to be flawless. The galaxy has seen Primarchs fall to rage, to despair, to ambition. But only one fell to beauty. Only one damned himself because he looked into a mirror and liked what was looking back. And the worst part, there was a moment, one single moment where he could have stopped all of it. He had the clarity, he had the choice, he saw exactly what he was becoming, and he surrendered anyway. Let me tell you about the Phoenician, and let me tell you why his name is a curse whispered on 10,000 worlds. Fulgrim's story doesn't begin in splendor. It begins in filth. His gestation pod, scattered by the machinations of the chaos gods across the galaxy, like all his brothers, crash-landed on Chemos. And Chemos was a dying world. Not dying in any dramatic sense. No alien invasion, no cataclysm. It was simply running out. Resources depleting. Factories grinding slower every decade. The population shrinking. Rationing everything. Watching the slow arithmetic of extinction close in around them. It was a world that had given up on tomorrow. The people of Chemos weren't warriors. They weren't conquerors. They were survivors in the bleakest, most exhausted sense of the word. They were waiting to die and calling it life. Into this came a child who refused to accept limits. Fulgrim was found by the workers of a settlement called Kallax. Unlike some Primarchs who were raised by kings or wolves or warlords, Fulgrim was raised by factory laborers, common people. And from the very start, something about him was different, and I don't just mean the obvious superhuman physiology. Fulgrim looked at the decaying infrastructure of Chemos and didn't see inevitability. He saw a problem to solve. Where everyone else had accepted decline as the natural order, this child, barely old enough to walk among men, started optimizing. He improved mining outputs. He redesigned manufacturing processes. He found efficiencies no one had thought to look for because no one had believed efficiency was still possible. By the time Fulgrim was 15, he was the executive leader of Kallax, not through conquest, not through intimidation, through sheer undeniable competence, and the results spoke for themselves. Under his guidance, Chemos didn't just stabilize, it began to recover. Resources flowed, the factories hummed with renewed purpose. For the first time in generations, the people of Chemos had surplus, and with surplus came something Fulgrim valued above almost anything else. Time. Time for art, for music, for culture, for the pursuit of something beyond mere survival. This is the detail that matters. Remember it, because it's the seed of everything that comes after. Fulgrim didn't just want to save Chemos, he wanted to make it beautiful. He wanted to elevate it. The survival was never the point. The transcendence was the point, and that distinction, that razor-thin line between excellence and obsession, is where the Phoenician's damnation was always waiting. Now here's something people overlook. When the Emperor finally arrived at Chemos, what he found was extraordinary. Most Primarchs had conquered their worlds through warfare. Fulgrim had conquered his through Renaissance. The Emperor didn't find a warlord sitting on a throne of skulls. He found a statesman, an artist, a visionary who had single-handedly dragged a dying civilization back from the brink and taught it to dream again. And Fulgrim's reaction to meeting the Emperor is unlike any other Primarch's. There was no challenge, no suspicion, no testing of strength. Fulgrim knelt, immediately, willingly, joyfully. He recognized the Emperor not as a rival, but as the ultimate embodiment of everything he had been striving toward. Here was perfection in the flesh. Here was the standard he would spend eternity trying to meet. The Emperor, in turn, gave Fulgrim command of the Third Legion, the Emperor's children. And that name, that specific name, carries weight that most people don't fully appreciate. The Emperor's children were the only Space Marine Legion permitted to bear the Palatine Aquila, the Emperor's own personal heraldry, upon their chest plates. The only ones. Not the Luna Wolves, not the Dark Angels, not the Ultramarines, the Third Legion. That wasn't a name they chose. It was a name the Emperor bestowed. Think about what that means. Of all 20 legions, Fulgrim's was the one the Emperor marked as his own reflection, his children, in the most personal, most intimate sense. And if you're wondering whether that level of favor might put a certain kind of pressure on a Primarch already obsessed with living up to impossible standards, well, you're beginning to understand the tragedy. But there was a problem waiting for Fulgrim when he took command, and it was devastating. The Emperor's children had suffered a catastrophe before his arrival. A gene seed crisis, a flaw or contamination in their genetic repository, had nearly wiped the Legion out. Where other legions numbered in the tens of thousands, the Emperor's children had been reduced to roughly 200 Marines. 200, a legion in name only, a skeleton, a ghost of what should have been. For any other Primarch, this might have been a logistical setback. For Fulgrim, it was personal. These were the Emperor's children, his father's namesake, Legion, and they were broken. So Fulgrim did what Fulgrim always did. He rebuilt, meticulously, obsessively. He oversaw every aspect of the Legion's reconstruction, insisting on quality over speed, perfection over quantity. Every recruit was held to standards that bordered on the impossible. Every suit of armor was maintained to an immaculate degree. Every tactical doctrine was refined, tested, refined again. The Emperor's children didn't just recover. They became, by many accounts, the most technically precise fighting force in the Imperium. Their swordsmanship was unmatched. Their coordination was flawless. Their discipline was a thing of artistry, and Fulgrim led from the front. Always, his silver hair streaming behind him, wielding a blade with a grace that made killing look like calligraphy. He was magnificent. His sons loved him with a fervor that went beyond loyalty into something closer to worship. And why wouldn't they? He had taken the worst hand any Primarch had been dealt, and turned it into a masterpiece. The Great Crusade saw the Emperor's children compile a record of compliance actions that was, by any metric, extraordinary. They fought alongside the Luna Wolves. They fought alongside the Iron Hands. They forged bonds that seemed unbreakable. And this is where I need you to hold two truths in your mind at once, because Fulgrim's closest brothers, the Primarchs he was nearest to, were Horus and Ferrus Manus. Horus, who would become the arch-traitor, and Ferrus, who would become his victim. Fulgrim stood at the exact intersection of loyalty and betrayal, and he didn't even know it. Not yet. The corruption of Fulgrim is not a sudden thing. It's a slow poisoning, and it begins with an object. During a compliance action on a world called Laren, the Emperor's children encountered a temple dedicated to Slaanesh, the chaos god of excess, of sensation, of pleasure and pain, twisted beyond all recognition. The world of Laren was Xenos held, inhabited by serpentine aliens whose entire civilization was an act of worship to the Dark Prince. The Emperor's children destroyed them utterly. The campaign was brutal, costly, and by every military measure, a success. But Fulgrim found something in that temple. A sword. A single, beautiful, impossibly perfect blade, shimmering with an iridescence that seemed to shift with the light, that seemed alive. The Lair blade. And Fulgrim, the connoisseur of all things exquisite, the Primarch who could not resist perfection when he saw it, picked it up. He should have destroyed it. His equerry, Julius Caesaron, his lord commanders, even the ambient feeling in that temple, everything screamed warning. But the blade was beautiful. And it called to something in Fulgrim that had always been there. That hunger, that need, that voice that whispered you could be more. The layer blade was a demonic weapon. Bound within it was a keeper of secrets, a greater demon of Slaanesh. And from the moment Fulgrim's fingers closed around its hilt, it began to whisper. Not loudly, not obviously, just a subtle influence, a gentle nudging of thoughts he already had. You deserve more. Your art could be greater, your senses could be sharper. Why accept limitation when transcendence is within reach? And here is what makes this so horrifying. The daemon didn't need to lie, it just needed to amplify what was already true. Fulgrim already believed in the pursuit of perfection above all else. The demon simply removed the barriers, the restraint, the wisdom, the humility, the small voice that says enough, one by one, like plucking strings from an instrument until only dissonance remains. The changes were gradual. The Emperor's children began to shift. Their pursuit of martial perfection became an obsession with sensation. Their art became darker, more extreme. Their music grew discordant, designed not to inspire, but to overwhelm. Marines who had once been paragons of discipline began seeking new experiences. Anything to feel more, to push further. Combat was no longer about victory. It was about the experience of killing, the beauty of violence, the art of suffering. Fulgrim's own behavior grew erratic. He became vain beyond measure, spending hours on his appearance, his armor, obsessing over details that would have been invisible to anyone else. He grew impatient with imperfection in others while becoming blind to the rot spreading through his own soul. His paintings, once things of genuine beauty, became disturbing, twisted, images that unsettled those who viewed them. And yet Fulgrim saw only improvement, only refinement, only the next step toward a perfection that kept receding like a horizon. Now remember, I told you about his two closest brothers, Horus and Phoenician. Here is where those threads converge, and it is devastating. Horus fell first. The War Master's corruption on Davin is another story for another time, but when Horus turned against the Emperor, he reached out to those he believed he could sway, and Fulgrim was high on that list. Not because Fulgrim was weak, but because Horus understood him. He understood that Fulgrim's need for recognition, for validation, for the acknowledgement that he was the greatest, could be weaponized. Horus offered Fulgrim a simple proposition. The Emperor is holding you back. Under me, you would be unleashed. You would be free to pursue your vision without limit. And the daemon in the blade whispered, yes. But Fulgrim's loyalty was not so easily broken. Even corrupted, even compromised, some part of the Phoenician resisted. And so, Horus gave him a task, a test of commitment. Go to Phoenician, your closest brother, your dearest friend. Convince him to join us, and if you can't convince him, well, Fulgrim went to Pharis, and this meeting, aboard Phoenician's flagship, is one of the most painful scenes in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. Because Fulgrim genuinely tried, he laid out Horus's case, he appealed to their brotherhood, he believed, truly believed, that Pharis would see reason, that Pharis would join him, that they would stand side by side in this new order. Phoenician listened, and then Phoenician tried to kill him. The Gorgon saw through it all, saw the corruption, the taint, the madness creeping behind his brother's perfect eyes. And he reacted the only way Phoenician knew how, with iron fury. The two Primarchs fought on that deck, brothers who had forged weapons for each other, who had laughed together, who had bled together. And Fulgrim barely escaped with his life. That rejection broke something in Fulgrim, or maybe it freed something, because after that day the last restraints fell away. The Phoenician committed fully to Horus's rebellion, and the atrocities began. The Dropsite Massacre on Istvan V. This is the moment that defines the Horus Heresy's opening act. The Loyalist legions, including Phoenician and his Iron Hands, were lured into a trap. They dropped onto Istvan V, believing reinforcements were coming. Those reinforcements were traitors. The killing field that followed was apocalyptic, and at its center, like some terrible destiny completing itself, Fulgrim found Ferris again. They fought, not as brothers this time, as enemies. And Fulgrim, empowered by the demonic blade, drove by a fury that was no longer entirely his own, took his brother's head. And in that moment, for one single, crystalline instant, Fulgrim was himself again. The demon's grip slipped. The madness parted like a curtain, and Fulgrim looked down at what he held. The severed head of Ferris Manus, his brother, his friend. The weight of what he had done crashed through him like a wave. He screamed, he wept, he understood, completely and without illusion, what he had become. This is the moment I mentioned at the beginning. The moment of clarity, the choice, and Fulgrim surrendered. Not to the Emperor, not to redemption, to the demon. He couldn't bear the grief. He couldn't face what he'd done, and so he opened himself willingly. Let the Keeper of Secrets pour into every corner of his consciousness. Let it drown the guilt in sensation, in pleasure, in excess, in anything at all, except the memory of his brother's eyes. Some sources say the demon possessed him entirely, locking the real Fulgrim in a prison within his own mind. Others suggest Fulgrim clawed his way back to dominance later, banishing the demon, but that the Primarch who resurfaced was so fundamentally altered that it made no difference. The truth might be worse than either version. The truth might be that Fulgrim chose this, every step, every atrocity, every scream, because choosing damnation was easier than living with what he'd done as himself. The heresy ground on. The Emperor's children descended into madness that defies description. On world after world, they committed acts so depraved that even other traitor legions were disgusted. The World Eaters killed for killing's sake. The Death Guard endured suffering as a point of philosophy. But the Emperor's children pursued sensation itself. Every nerve ending, every possible experience. Pain and pleasure intertwined until the distinction was meaningless. They became noise marines, their weapons, literal sonic devastation. Weaponized sound designed to overload the senses of everything in range. They became torturers, artists of agony, sculptors who worked in living flesh, and at their head, Fulgrim became something else entirely. His body changed, whether through the demon's influence or Slaanesh's direct blessing. The Primarch, who had once been the most beautiful being in the Imperium, transformed. His lower body became serpentine, coiling and massive. His face, still beautiful, carried an alien quality that was no longer human in any recognizable way. Forearms, a body that radiated intoxicating musk. Eyes that promised every pleasure and delivered every horror. He had ascended, or descended, into a demon prince of Slaanesh. The Phoenician was dead. What remained wore his face. After the heresy's failure, after Horus fell at the Emperor's hand aboard the vengeful spirit, the traitor legions fled into the Eye of Terror. And within that roiling hell of unreality, Fulgrim carved out his own domain. A demon world, shaped to his desires. A planet of impossible sensations, where the laws of physics bend to aesthetic whim, where entire populations exist solely to provide new experiences for a being who has exhausted every sensation the material universe can offer. The Emperor's children shattered, without the unifying discipline that Fulgrim had once provided, and which he now had no interest in maintaining. The Legion fragmented into war bands. Individual companies and squads scattered across the Eye of Terror and into real space, each pursuing their own depraved obsessions. Noise marines, pleasure cults, flesh sculptors. They raid, they corrupt, they abduct populations of entire worlds to fuel their endless appetite for stimulation. They are in many ways the most dangerous of the traitor legions, not because of their military might, but because of what they represent. The promise that excess feels good, that surrendering to desire is liberation. That perfection lies just one more step beyond the boundary you swore you'd never cross. And Fulgrim himself? He stirs occasionally. In the late stages of the 41st millennium and into the era of the Dark Imperium, there are whispers. The demon Primarchs are waking, one by one, drawn back to the material universe by the Great Rift, by the return of Robout Guilliman, by the scent of a galaxy tearing itself apart. Fulgrim's name surfaces in prophecies, in the screams of psychers, in the visions of Eldar Farseers who see a serpentine shadow coiling around the future of entire sectors. If Fulgrim returns in full, and the lore increasingly suggests it is a matter of when, not if, the Imperium will face something worse than a military threat. It will face a philosophical one. Because Fulgrim doesn't destroy civilizations the way Angron does, through brute violence. He seduces them. He offers them what they secretly want. He holds up a mirror and shows them a version of themselves that is more beautiful, more refined, more alive, and all it costs is everything they are. There is even a clone, a perfect, uncorrupted clone of Fulgrim, created by the mad Mechanica Magos, Fabius Bile, from the original Primarch's genetic material. This clone exists. It has appeared in the lore. It possesses Fulgrim's body and abilities, but none of the demonic taint, none of the corruption, and the implications of that are staggering. A loyal Fulgrim, a redeemed Phoenician. It would be the single greatest narrative reversal in Warhammer 40,000 history. Whether Games Workshop ever pulls that trigger remains to be seen, but the fact that the seed has been planted tells you something about the kind of story Fulgrim's arc truly is. It's not just a tragedy. It's a tragedy that could, in theory, be undone. And that possibility makes the original fall hurt even more, because that's the crux of Fulgrim. He was never destined for this. He wasn't a brute. He wasn't a tyrant. He was an artist, a builder, a leader who turned a dying world into a garden. The same hands that composed symphonies and forged masterwork blades are the hands that murdered his closest brother and damned 100 billion souls to suffering beyond imagination. The lesson of Fulgrim is the oldest lesson in human storytelling, that the line between aspiration and obsession is invisible until you've already crossed it, that the pursuit of perfection, untempered by humility, unchecked by the willingness to accept being merely good enough, becomes its own kind of madness, and that when someone offers you a shortcut to the ideal version of yourself, the cost is always the self you were trying to perfect in the first place. The Phoenician sought to transcend his limits, and he did. He became limitless, limitless cruelty, limitless hunger, limitless emptiness wearing a crown of beauty. And somewhere, in a prison of his own making, behind eyes that glow with the light of a god he never meant to serve, some fragment of the real Fulgrim might still exist, might still remember the forges of Chemos, the sound of his first symphony, the weight of Ferrus Manus's hand on his shoulder, and that fragment, if it exists, is screaming. If you enjoyed this deep dive, shoot the like